Hello, everyone. Welcome back. I hope you're suitably caffeinated for this great discussion we're about to have on building resilient supply chains. To our virtual viewers, please submit your questions through the chat, and we will try and bring them into the room. And to moderate this discussion, I'm delighted to introduce Esche Nelson, economics and business reporter for the New York Times, with her in-person speaker, Erin, and her virtual speakers, who she will introduce in just a moment. Enjoy the session.
Yeah, great. All right. Good morning, everyone. It's nice to see you all today and everyone who's watching online. My name is Esche Nelson. I'm a business and economics reporter for the New York Times. I'm based in our London office. I'm really delighted to be here today for this session on building resilient supply chains. With me in the room, I have Erin Mazan, who is the Chief Sustainability Officer and Vice President of Interface. Online, we have Christian Ron, who is the co-founder of Normative, and behind me here I have Manik Suri, the founder and CEO of Therma. So I feel like many people in lots of countries recently have been experiencing supply chain disruptions, bottlenecks, manufacturers really kind of struggling to get the goods they need, seeing those prices go up, which have infiltrated into higher consumer prices. As an economics reporter, I feel like I spend all my time at the moment talking about inflation, worrying about the cost of living. And these are the concerns that have come about because of the reopening from pandemic lockdowns. But I know that lots of people have been thinking, the pandemic is just like a taste of some of those disruptions we're going to see from climate change if the transition isn't smooth and isn't just. And so as we think about the disruptions we're already feeling now, we want to talk a little bit about how you can make supply chains resilient, not just to public health issues, but to climate change and to those transitions, whether it's extreme weather events or considering what the consequences of policy changes will be. And we have Christian and Manik, who are both looking at tech solutions within supply chains and looking at how you can reduce carbon emissions, how you can make them more efficient. And Erin's going to talk to us about Interface, which is like a really innovative company, and I'm not going to steal her moment, so I'm going to let her talk about that. But actually, I wanted to start with Manik, who can tell us a little bit about Therma and its process of building resilient supply chains and what it means for the cold chain industry. Just, tell us a little bit about what Therma is, please.
Absolutely. It's a pleasure to be here, Esche, and I think that you framed it really powerfully. I run a company called Therma based in the San Francisco Bay Area. We're focused on building a smart cold chain, really taking on the challenge of clean cooling. Cooling in the cold chain is responsible for moving over $1 trillion of perishables around the world every year. It's how we get fruits and vegetables, dairy, proteins, and of course, drugs and vaccines. And it's critical for human health and obviously taken on new valence in the last year and year and a half with the importance of vaccine delivery. But it's always been important for the last 100+ years. What most people don't realize is that cooling is responsible for almost 10% of all emissions from a carbon footprint standpoint, and there's a huge amount of waste. Take food, for example, and that's where we focus at Therma. The food supply chain has a huge carbon footprint, and roughly a third of all food that gets made is thrown out every year. A third, which is a crazy number. It's over 1.6 billion tons, $1 trillion problem according to the Boston Consulting Group. We're trying to tackle that using technology as a vector for change. We're using a combination of new data technologies and new sensor technologies. So using analytics and real-time sensors to catch spoilage events, prevent loss in the supply chain, help reduce overcooling, which is another form, another source of waste, and to ultimately reduce refrigerant emissions. Those are the three big areas where we see opportunities: food waste, energy waste, and refrigerant waste. And I think technology is only one part of the solution, but it is a powerful way to achieve, to do more with less, which is, I think, one of the challenges of the 21st century.
That's an amazing statistic there, that a third of all food waste is lost. How much of that is happening in the supply chain before it gets to our tables?
Yeah, roughly, depending on the country, between a third and half of that waste is actually happening upstream. And the problem is worse in developing economies where infrastructure is weaker, where there's less availability of cold storage. And I think the cold chain is one supply chain. It's not the only one, but it's a critical one, both from a human health and a planet health standpoint. And you read stories and you see examples of fish rotting on the docks in many markets because you can't get them into a refrigerated warehouse. You see food in granaries getting destroyed because it can't be stored and moved fast enough, and many, many examples. But it's a huge source of inefficiency.
Great. Christian, tell us a little bit about Normative and what it's trying to do to help. I know you work with a lot of small businesses, especially.
Yep. Thanks a lot for having me, first of all. So Normative is a carbon accounting engine. What that means is that we help companies account for their full carbon footprint so they can take the right action to go towards net zero emissions. And this is something that is incredibly important. I mean, now at COP, everyone is talking about the contributions of various governments, but we need to keep in mind that it's not, the government organizations that are doing the carbon polluting. It is the companies within the jurisdictions of governments. So unless we can account for carbon emissions, it is going to be very hard to solve climate change. And right now you have a situation where we need to move trillions from non-sustainable to sustainable companies. And in order for that capital to be moved effectively, we need to start to account for carbon emissions, because in the end of the day, what gets measured gets managed. And there is a strong connection between that and supply chain emissions. So, I mean, what we see overall in the global north and certainly in Scandinavia, for example, where I'm from, is that a lot of industry is being moved to other countries where there are less clean energy grids. So on average, if you take an average company, around 90% of emissions are located in the supply chain. So it's not enough just to go towards net zero emissions in your own organization. You need to also look to your supply chain and decarbonize that. So that is going to be like one of the biggest challenges that we're going to face in the next 2-3 decades up to 2050.
Yeah, I mean, we're almost 2 weeks into COP now, and I feel like something we hear about is the Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3 emissions. Can you just talk to us a little bit about what that means and how much Normative is trying to include all three of those?
Yes. So Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3, that is a technical terminology where Scope 1 means the emissions from the own operations of a business. So that might be the vehicle fleet, or if you're directly burning fossil fuels within your operations in another way, release of methane gas. It can be, different things. Scope 2, that is emissions from utilities. So that might be heating of facilities. It might be procured electricity. And scope 3 is the value chain based emissions. And as I said earlier, if you look at the data, if you just take a randomly selected company, then typically 90% of emissions are located in scope 3, which is essentially the supply chain and value chain, which makes that incredibly important.
Yeah, thank you. So Interface, I don't know how many people know of the company, but they probably know of the products, right? We're talking about carpet tiles, and they're all over schools and colleges and airports, so we might be familiar with the product, but Interface is almost a model for what Christian and Manik are trying to help companies achieve. Can you tell us a little story, kind of take us down memory lane? I want to go back to 1994, when Interface came up with Mission Zero, and explain to us what exactly that meant.
Sure. So thank you for having us. As you said, Interface is a billion-dollar flooring company. And the most interesting thing about it is we are trying to take the technologies and the accounting tools and really shift our supply chain. This started for Interface over 25 years ago when the founder of our company, Ray Anderson, read a book and had a fundamental shift in his mindset about business and the role of business, and set Interface on a course first to have zero environmental impact and now to become a carbon negative business by 2040. And that caused a transformation in our operations, with our raw materials, in our supply chain. So I think we're proof that climate action, deep climate action, is really possible and good for business. So one manifestation of that is last year we launched carbon negative carpet tile products. And these are products that, after a life cycle assessment from raw material extraction until they leave our company, actually store more carbon than they emit. And they are Interface's way to address carbon in our supply chain, certainly, but they're also a provocation to the built environment about where we all need to be going. If we're going to build net zero buildings or absolute zero buildings and zero cities, we need to have the products to actually deliver on that.
Yeah. So back then, you know, mission zero wasn't what we're talking about now, which is net zero, right? It was something else. It was something even more ambitious.
It was
Tell us why you're
real
laughing.
zero. Mission zero was absolute zero. So in 1994, you know, the CEO of our business, Ray Anderson, said, we are going to strive to have zero impact on the natural world across the operations and products. And with that really ambitious goal of real zero and not net zero, you know, that was so ambitious that it got our suppliers focused, it got our employees focused, it, you know, turned up the innovation engine in our business, and we were able to deliver something very close to that. You know, we've reduced absolute greenhouse gas emissions at Interface 95%. We've reduced waste 91%, and that level of ambition, I think the lesson for us and for any company who's here or thinking about committing is we have to have an extremely high ambition level if we're going to keep the planet at a safe temperature. So it isn't net zero, it's real zero, and it's even beyond that to sort of carbon negative. You know, that's where we all need to be thinking.
So when this decision was being made and the work was being done to see how Interface can reduce its emissions, was most of this happening within the company, or were you having to look really far down your supply chain? Like, where were those kind of real crucial points that emissions needed to be reduced?
We looked everywhere, of course, at first, but the biggest part of our carbon impact, and I think the Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3 is great for technical accounting people, we just think about it and talk about it like the carbon that results as a result of our company doing business is everything. And when we started looking at reductions, the biggest part of that carbon was in our Scope 3 or supply chain, the raw materials that are extracted and used to make our products. So we focused really heavily there on getting off virgin petroleum-derived materials, using recycled materials, using bio-based materials, and we can say that we have collectively over 2 decades reduced the carbon footprint of the products close to 80% by supply chain innovation, by engaging suppliers, and in 2018 we were able to say that every product we make is carbon neutral all around the world. We know that's not enough, but that's where companies need to start.
Yeah. When you were changing the raw materials that we're using, were you having to think about new locations for collecting these materials? I'm kind of curious as to how it geographically impacted what your supply chain looked like.
You know, one of the biggest barriers at first was just mindsets. You know, 20 years ago when we went to the nylon suppliers who supply the really beautiful fuzzy fiber on the top of most carpet tile products, the answer when we said we need recycled content was, it's impossible, we can't do it. No one's ever asked us to do that. It can't happen. But persistence, mindset shift, bringing innovative thinking to them, in some instances co-innovating with them, funding collaborative technologies. So we have some technologists here, right? You have to try a million different things, sometimes modeling the behavior you want in pilot projects. You know, that really helped us work with those real suppliers instead of moving to different suppliers or moving to different places. We bet on those suppliers and said we must change their mindset. 15 years later, they were able to deliver recycled content that not just goes now into Interface's products, 100% of the nylon is recycled. It's gone across our industry and now into the fashion industry.
Amazing. Manik, can you talk to us a little bit about Therma's geographical footprint as well? Are these cold chain, is it mostly regional? Is it international? When you're thinking about having your technology in places to get this information, like where are you having to look?
Absolutely. I think there's an opportunity to bring both efficiency and transparency in the cold chain into both developed markets and developing markets. Today, Therma is deployed in around a dozen countries, almost all of which are in the developed global north, and where mature cold chains have been around for 50 plus years. That's, of course, where there's a lot of buying power and a lot of companies that are first movers in adopting new solutions because they have the wherewithal and the access. But one of the things we're aiming to do is bending the cost curve around process efficiency, trying to reduce the barrier to accessing these technologies by making them available. So we've shifted the model around sensors and automation from a hardware model to a software model. So instead of having to buy hardware, Therma is an entirely subscription-based product. That makes it a lot more accessible to companies and small businesses in particular that don't have the capital expenditure budgets. And I think there's a huge opportunity in the cold chain specifically in the developing world, where much of the waste and much of the loss happens in markets that don't have well-established refrigeration and cooling. And unfortunately, those are also the same countries that are most affected by food loss, food spoilage, and climate. It's incredible and extremely disappointing to realize that a third of food is thrown out and 800 million people are still dealing with malnutrition. So, the juxtaposition of those two facts, and the fact, as we all know, that the global south is largely going to bear a heavier burden on, when climate change continues to affect all of us, makes it, I think, imperative for any company that's innovating to think about developing markets. And that's part of how we see the theory of change.
Yeah, one of the other things I wanted to ask you about is when we are dealing with the disruptions at the moment because of the pandemic, because of shipping, etc., a lot of the designers think maybe we need to have shorter supply chains. I mean, do you think it's always right to assume that it's better to have smaller and shorter supply chains? Like, how are you thinking about efficiency here?
Well, it's a great question. It is one of these, sometimes counterintuitive questions. There's been a lot of discussion in the food industry and food supply chain around going local over the past decade and a half. It turns out that in many cases, going local could actually increase your carbon footprint depending on the resource intensivity of the production environment. So it's not always clear that going local and reducing the physical distance that a product moves is the right answer. That said, I think there is a powerful argument around, changing our consumption patterns to be more sustainable and to drive resiliency. When we buy out of season produce and out of season products and have them shipped 8,000 miles, the transit and the carbon footprint of all of the moving parts to get that product to us is massive. And I think that's a real opportunity for the consumer, for the buyer, and for the supplier, all of the major stakeholders. So you really have to look product by product, but it's not, there's not a one-size-fits-all answer, I'd say.
Christian, I can see you nodding to that point, that it's not necessarily always better to have shorter supply chains.
Absolutely. I completely agree with you, Manik. It's you need to think about these things rationally. And what we see is that typically the transportation impact from a carbon emissions perspective is somewhere between 5-10%. So then the question is like, all right, if you can have an efficiency increase with more than 10%, typically this is just a kind of average heuristics way of thinking, then it might make sense to actually have a bit of a longer supply chain, because obviously some regions it makes sense to grow certain crops. In certain regions it makes sense to manufacture certain goods because of how cold or how hot or other weather conditions. So I think you need to have a quantitative perspective when you think about these things, and not fall into the trap of saying longer supply chains is always bad. You should, of course, don't get me wrong, try to decrease them, but I think you need a data-driven perspective where you really account for this. I actually have a question for Erin as well, if you don't mind.
Go for it.
But I think one thing that you mentioned, which I think is a key word here, is that you work with life cycle assessments. It means that you're working through your scope 1, 2, and 3, and the total carbon footprint. But I think what we're seeing over and over again is that a lot of companies are making claims that are okay, net zero, carbon neutral, etc., etc. But often you can't compare those claims because companies don't have a uniform way of accounting for their total emissions, and sometimes and this is the question, like, do you feel like you are able to kind of I don't know, reap the rewards for being more ambitious and actually accounting for the full carbon footprint compared to, let's say, someone else just doing their scope 1 and scope 2 and maybe buy some offsets and call it a day?
Well, I'm going to tack on a slightly less polite version of that question, which is, why should we believe you when you say that I got to absolute zero?
That's really good. I mean, I think skepticism is needed, right? Because it's what allows the companies like us who do the real work to sort of be elevated above the other ones. And so how do we really deal with that? Why should you trust us? Well, I mean, everything that we do, we get third-party verified, whether it's life cycle assessments, whether it's environmental product declarations, whether it's claims that we make, we take them through not just the data, but the actual product claim, we take them through independent third-party verification. I think it's super important. And so, yeah, I mean, that's where we're able to outcompete or distinguish ourselves from competitors. And it takes a lot of internal training. I mean, at Interface, what we're doing is we're competing with other companies who are selling flooring products into green building projects around the world, into airports, into hospitals. Every single one of their salespeople has a claim. So we spend a lot of time training our team. We spend a lot of time on transparency, and we pay a lot of money to disclose and do third-party assessments. And I think for any consumer, that's what you have to do, is you have to be really sure that a company who's claiming they're carbon neutral also, for example, like Interface does, has their scope 3 carbon emissions on their website. You can go check it. You can see that it's been third-party verified. And I think skepticism is good right now, but we also can't let that get us all to a place where we doubt everything. There's a huge part of inspiration and optimism that we're going to need to deliver the future we want and to keep, a safe temperature at the planet within distance. So I would say let's also moderate that with still telling those stories, still talking about the benefits of the technologies, and finding a way to position data in a way that inspires and moves people, right?
Christian, so I believe you work with UK SMEs as well as part of your role. And I just wanted to ask, obviously, a small company is probably down in someone else's supply chain, will also have its own, is also kind of trying to figure out how they're going to cope with this pandemic recovery. What are the solutions that you can offer them right now to do this work, to do this extra accounting, when I imagine they already feel under quite a lot of constraints because of just the past 2 years?
Excellent question. So, I mean, helping with carbon emissions accounting is what we do and what we have done for several years. Our partnership with the UK government and the SME Climate Hub, which is a part of the Race to Zero campaign that we started with the We Mean Business Coalition and Exponential Roadmap Initiative, that is something that is specifically tailored towards SMEs that are struggling to actually meet the challenge of climate change. And what we're doing right now is with support from Google, we're developing tools for the SME Climate Hub and the UK Climate Hub. So when SMEs come on board and take a net zero commitment, it's you get the right tools that you need in order to account for your emissions, and those are the tools that we're building together with Google at the moment. And I related to that, there is also a group that we work with called the 1.5 Supply Chain Leaders, that is a part of the Exponential Roadmap Initiative, with large companies like Unilever, BT, Nestle, IKEA, that are really trying to engage their supply chain in setting a net zero commitment. So that would also be a recommendation for anyone that is listening here, representing a large enterprise to check out the 1.5 supply chain leaders as well.
I want to go to some audience questions in a few minutes, but first I wanted a question for all of you, which is, when we're thinking about reducing emissions, thinking about resilient supply chains, how do you ensure that that process doesn't cut out emerging markets and developing countries, and in that drive for sustainability, you don't just think, yes, we're going to just remove working in countries that have less green energy grids, as you mentioned before. If we want this to be kind of a just transition and an inclusive transition, how do you go about making sure that you don't say the fastest way is to ignore certain countries? Anyone wants to start?
Happy to jump in, and I agree with so many of the comments that Christian and Aaron have made. I think one of the most powerful levers for decarbonizing the supply chain is to educate and to partner with suppliers, and not necessarily to replace suppliers outright, but to shift the incentive up the supply chain to get actions taken that are actually good for the supplier in the medium and long run. For example, shifting to recyclables, or shifting to lower carbon inputs, or changing practices, whether those are farming practices, manufacturing practices, or adopting new technologies, tools like Therma's sensor approach, or transparency and accounting initiatives like normative. Frankly, I think there's a lot of opportunity to help suppliers clean up and improve their carbon footprint using the buying power that larger corporates and even SMEs in the developed markets have, without having to ignore or take advantage of or leave developing markets behind. And so I think that's one of the really powerful levers and a way to align both sides.
I think one way we've been successful doing it, being just $1 billion company that's not the size of a Walmart that could sort of dictate change, is to model the behavior you want. So a great example for us was a pilot project we did called the Networks Project, and it was showing by doing. So we created with our nylon suppliers, the Zoological Society of London and fishing communities in the Philippines, a way that ghost fishing nets could be pulled out of the marine environment, processed by local communities in the Philippines, sent to our supply chain to be made into recycled material that goes into our carpet products. And it was a great way to say, this is the sort of equitable change that we want to see modeled in the supply chain. We can talk about sustainable livelihoods. We can talk about working with developing communities, but why don't we just show you in a pilot project? Why don't we convince you what it's going to look like? And there was skepticism from our supply chain initially going in, but the second those types of projects are seen and manifested and get great PR, and that's the moment, I think, when you're small, you can model the change that you want to have happen, and that's where we've been successful in just starting to make a shift.
Yeah. Christian, did you have anything you wanted to add on that point?
Yeah, I think you need to engage with your suppliers for sure. And you need a data-driven approach to do so. I think we have a problem today where some companies, carbon footprint calculations, especially in scope 3, is not comparable to other companies. So that means you can essentially get away with not engaging your supply chain. And I think, so I think we need to have a data-driven narrative in terms of supply chain engagement towards net zero emissions. So basically always ask the question, where are your scope 3 metrics? Because otherwise it's a little bit like a global race to the bottom, where there will always be someone in the supply chain that will be okay with driving their entire operations through non-sustainable practices. And as long as there's kind of the incentives to hide that part of the supply chain away, and you get away with it, you don't create the right environment to actually engage with your suppliers. So I think companies need to engage with their supply chain, but the incentives to do so, I think, will be created once we start to have a more data-driven narrative and ask where are your scope 3 emissions and have they been validated?
Yeah, I think your point there, though, about it being comparable is important, because otherwise we could all just drown in more and more data, and more information doesn't necessarily lead to insight if we're just having it kind of like thrown at us. Okay, were there any audience questions? I have plenty more, but great. I think a microphone is coming to you. Thanks.
Hi, thank you very much to all of you. I'm Kital from INSEAD, the business school. My question is about the trade-offs between these actions in calculating and addressing scope 3 emissions and your bottom line, right? So cost a lot. Can you talk a little bit about these trade-offs and also how you handle your shareholders' expectations to get things done? Thank you.
Sure.
Great question.
I mean, I'll start.
Great, yeah.
I actually don't think it costs a lot. I think it's, I think there's a misperception about cost and responsibility, but I will admit that interface is quite small. And however, I think our experience is common across other companies, which is when you start to dig in to measuring your scope 3 emissions, there's definitely a materiality part of that, right? Which is there tend to be a couple key suppliers which are responsible for the bulk of, in our case, our scope 3 emissions, and that's common for other product manufacturers. So we're not necessarily talking about assessments and real data from hundreds of suppliers as much as we may be talking about pick your top 5 or 10. And in our instance, we did that with a third of an internal person's resource who was already an environmental data person, and we also pulled a lot of the data from life cycle assessments that had already been done. So I think there's a little bit of a myth about the complexity and the time and the cost associated with this, number one. And number two, I mean, I think it's about framing us needing to say to companies, we expect you to understand the full implications, the full carbon implications of doing business. And that is scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. We need to redefine that narrative. We need to sort of say that's what is expected of companies and kind of move on. And the best way that we say that is we just post it publicly. And we are now increasingly saying to our supply chain and our suppliers, this is expected of you to give us this data.
I was going to say, there was a question in there about your shareholders too. Obviously, the interface has been doing this for a long time, so I'm curious as to whether you just feel like your shareholders are already on board with that message, and thus it doesn't maybe require as much convincing as some newer companies or some companies just now getting involved might face.
That's fair. I mean, I think people who are invested in our stock have heard us talking about this for 20 years, but also one of the reasons they are invested in us is because we've been successful in delivering on sustainability, and it's become part of the brand. So we don't get really skeptical questions around sort of why are you doing all this. I think we're a little bit beyond that.
Yeah, Christian, can you speak to that point as well about the cost that companies face?
Yeah, I completely agree with Erin's point. Also on the fact that materiality is key, and it is typically 20 suppliers that are responsible for 80% of emissions. So it's about identifying them in a data-driven way and work together with them. And the costs are not huge. I think the cost of inaction is a lot higher. And I think an important exercise that all businesses should do is to say, all right, let's screen our scope 3 emissions. And there is a social cost of carbon. And as the climate crisis intensifies, the real cost of carbon will eventually converge towards the social cost. So if you do a little bit of modeling, and you factor in the social cost of carbon, will you even be a profitable business? And so I think it's essential in order to be profitable in the long run to start to think about your supply chain, because it's not something that you change over a day. Also to Erin's point, you have worked with this, and I think you said plus 15 years. So I mean, you need to start today in order to make the right decisions that will affect your supply chains 5, 10, 15 years in the future.
Manik, I want to bring you in too, but let me just ask you, on top of that, is this where kind of government policy comes in too? Because, right, the cost might be high, but if it becomes clear that the cost of not taking action is going to be higher later because policy is changing, I'm just kind of curious if that's something your customers are noticing.
It is, I think there is, I want to address the government angle, and I also want to double down on what Christian and Aaron said. I feel like we're in violent agreement on this, which is such a critical aspect to the decarbonization of supply chains. Government is increasingly setting the rules of the road in ways that are shifting incentives to decarbonize. They have to do that in response to the crises that we face as a collective. And, though it's been challenging, I think, to get collective action, it's happening. And I think this last 2-week, gathering of leaders to discuss and make commit to the newest emissions reduction is an example of that. I would say that it's not just government that's driving the decarbonization, though the incentives are shifting. For instance, new regulation in the US that cleaned up or reduced efficiency slippage in equipment. Cooling equipment standards have become a lot more stringent in the last year because of new administration policies in the White House that were passed in December of 20. That's a good example of government coming in, forcing businesses to change how they buy and build. But I think that the myth and the misnomer that taking on decarbonization in the supply chain increases cost to the buyer and the consumer, it really, the data doesn't support that. And whether you look at a specific company like Interface or across tens of thousands of firms, there's quite a bit of recent reporting on this. The World Economic Forum and BCG had a shared report on decarbonization of 8 major supply chains responsible for 50% of warming. And they found that over the medium term, none of the changes recommended increased consumer costs more than 4%, and generally around 1% to 2%. So there's very little increase in cost of goods to the consumer to taking efforts around process efficiency, recycling, swapping out for cleaner. But I want to say, even if there were, in some cases, some increase in cost, more and more consumers are willing to pay a premium, and more companies are trading at a premium for being more sustainable. So I would argue that it's actually both in your interest as a corporate. If you're a corporate decision maker responsible to shareholders, you're going to trade at a premium. You're going to get a more significant valuation from consumers and shareholders if you are cleaner and more sustainable. And many consumers are willing to pay a premium for certain products that are more sustainable. So I think the math is actually shifting, and the trade-up is not nearly as significant as many people think it might be.
Are there any more audience questions? I've got one here, and then we'll take the one from the lady behind at the same time. We'll take both.
Hi, thanks. Amazing panel, fantastic information. I was wondering if you could help demystify something, because I've just started looking at scope 1, 2, 3 reporting from some big companies. And I really want to understand the scope 3 kind of data, because if I look at you, and then I look at your tier 1 supplier, for instance, how does your scope 3 and their scope 3, where does it begin and end? And then the second question I have is that I'm hearing it like a decision maker supplier relationship, but then in reality, you've probably got 6, 7, 10 steps in the chain. So what's your process? How far do you go? Are they loops? How does it work?
Let's take one more question as well. Who you have the mic? Great, thanks.
My name is Vivian. I'm from a business in the community. Eddie, I'm absolutely in awe with what you have done so far. I do have some questions to dig a little bit, if that's okay. In terms of your work with the suppliers, what is the process? Extending her question, you put your proposition for them to become more sustainable, and do you support them? Do you help them in this journey? Or do you just change suppliers if they can't fulfill your demands? The second question is the view to all the panelists in regards to carbon emissions versus impact. There are some solutions that perhaps the emissions itself will be slightly higher, but the impact in the end will be better for the environment. So what your views are, and how do you take that into account in terms of just going on carbon emissions? It's like counting calories, isn't it? Haribos have the same calories of nuts, but nuts is more nutritious, put it that way. Thank you.
Great. I like that second question. You know, resilient supply chain isn't just going to be about your carbon emissions, and we should expand that. Right. There was one more question nearer the back row. Can I just take that at the same time? Who has the microphone? Great.
Thank you. As a consumer, I was just interested in hearing perhaps a little bit more about what I think Christian described as needing to be rational about the decisions we make, local versus a long distance. And if there is time, just to unpick that a little bit more, where we might get that kind of information to make those kinds of decisions.
Great. Thank you. So, Erin, let's start with you, and you can talk a little bit about how you're comparing your Scope 3 emissions with the emissions of your companies in your supply chain, and what you do if they can't meet the targets you're setting.
Sure. I'll try to answer those ones quickly. So kind of how would it work for us? So we are an incredibly efficient assembler of raw materials to make the products. So when we think about our Scope 3, there are a series of categories. Purchased raw materials. So those are everything, which would include the nylon, the things that go into the carpet tile backings that come from a third-party supplier. So within our Scope 3, our largest category would be those raw materials and the carbon impact associated with those from that third-party supplier. So we are capturing in our scope the energy that those companies are using and the carbon emissions associated with creating those raw materials. And so there would technically be an overlap then in terms of what they are reporting in their Scope 1 and 2, for example. So that's kind of where it overlaps, right? And so, yes, we try lots of things to both of your questions to try to engage them. In the early days, when we were training our teams on things like biomimicry and ecology, we would bring suppliers into those sessions. We had supplier sustainability summits where we would take everything we were learning at Interface and offer that to our suppliers, either in small sessions. We've also done peer-to-peer learning. So we've said to them, you must start using renewable energy. The best way to figure out how to do that is to talk to the guys in our factories who installed renewable energy in our operations, and from a peer-to-peer conversation, tell you how to do that. Our CEOs have also tried to influence the CEOs of our suppliers by engaging with them on a peer-to-peer level. We've also used instances where we've said, and I talked about recycled nylon, that was the hardest nut to crack in our supply chain. And so finally, Interface said to the 3 companies that were supplying us nylon at the time, whichever one of you can deliver recycled nylon, and we will help co-invest, we will help train, we will work together, we will experiment with you. Whoever gives us the solution first, you get our purchasing power. We will start doing much more business with you. So I think, one of the learnings is you just have to be nimble. You have to think about what level are you influencing at the CEO level, at the peer level. You have to think about co-innovating, co-investing, developing relationships. You have to try to model, as I said, if you get resistant suppliers, this is actually, guys, what it looks like. We're going to do a pilot project. We're going to show you what it will look like, and then we will see if you will like to scale that. I think all of those things are really, really important if you're really going to make change, right? And then there are instances where it's just never going to work, or we need to move on, or we innovate to a place where we're finding new raw materials. In the last year and a half, we've brought 5 new suppliers into our supply chain to support the carbon negative carpet tile products. So there will be some shift, but I think what we're realizing is 15 years ago when we asked for more sustainable raw materials, they weren't there. We had to help create them.
Erin, I think that point about also investing, co-investing, helping them, not just saying we want this on its own. Christian, we've only got a minute or so left. To that question about comparing emissions, can you speak to that, and also that last point around how we should find information to understand whether it's better or not to look local, or, as consumers, how do we do this, and if we're standing in our shops?
Yeah. So the way I understood the question was that, sometimes it might be trade-offs. So in some instance, your carbon emissions might go up a little bit, but there might be another important social or impact indicator that is actually, with a positive outcome increasing, and there might be trade-offs. So I think the important framework where I think the world needs to go, quite frankly, is to think about externalities accounting more broadly. So I mean, if you have carbon emissions, the reason we care about carbon emissions is that it's related to overall welfare and well-being in the long run. And same thing with ocean acidification or biodiversity or pollution and other factors. So we need kind of more of a integrated monetization and externalities framework in order to compare those types of trade-offs. And there are some good research teams out there, including within my own organization, working on that particular subject. But there's no simple rules of thumb, but it's obviously an important consideration to take into account. And on the question about comparability, it's something that is incredibly important, because right now you don't have comparability between the greenhouse gas accounts of different companies, and most, in our experience, only account for a subset. Some might only account for their electricity usage or business travel, and we need to be strict in terms of you should account for the scope 1, 2, and 3, and do that as rigorously as possible.
Okay, we are actually out of time, so I want to say thank you to my panelists. Thank you all for attending and watching online. I think the message is pretty clear that there are some amazing companies doing great work, but that actually there's still a really, really long way to go to make sure that we can understand what's happening along supply chains, making sure that data is not only available, but is inclusive and comparable. So yeah, plenty of work still to do, I guess. Thank you all for joining us. Have a great rest of your day. Thank you.
Guys. Good job.